wanted to not only do a couple things just to kind of help the meeting run swifter tonight. For introductions, I'm going to ask that you folks go ahead and just put your pronouns in the chat. You don't have to put your name because it'll already show up in the chat as your name. So we're asking that folks in lieu of a roll call tonight, we're just going to go ahead and ask that you put your pronouns within the chat. And then also, let's see, I'm going to let folks know that, I'm reading through my notes here. If you, throughout the presentations tonight, if you have a question and you want to put it in the chat, we will go through the chat. I'll pause to look at questions within the chat as well tonight. We'll also have time after each of our presentations that folks can ask it verbally as well. And so we're going to kind of manage the question and answer portion tonight that way. If you're having trouble with either the hand raise function of the chat, I highly encourage you to turn on your video and just kind of give me a wave and things like that, and we'll recognize that and also try to keep the flow moving a little more smoothly tonight. Again, welcome. My name's Anu. What we'll be doing tonight is, again, kind of laying some of that foundational information for you folks. We'll have two different presentations specifically around vaccine safety, and then, vaccine information, and then vaccine distribution in Oregon as it stands. Before we jump into that piece, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our OHA folks to address the latest about what was information that was sent out from our federal partners today. So I'll hand it over to Rachel or Kara, whoever would like to take that piece on.
I can speak to that. So it's been a whirlwind day, and we heard today, and actually, and I'll forward this, get this soon, the governor's press release or statement that just came out, just a few minutes ago, hot off the press. So you all will have that in writing too. But it was announced that by the current administration that they will be releasing the doses that they have in stock. And that also the recommendation was to prioritize or expand to 65 and older. And they had some other considerations in there too from the federal government, like those with comorbidities. And so Governor Brown just released that she's supporting clearly the 65 and over. And so for the vaccine advisory folks, those were some of the conversations that we plan to have. So just acknowledging that we're just hearing this information. We know that we'll need to recalibrate in terms of, what our conversations look like moving forward. So we'll have more on that. But that 65 and over, as well as educators, which had been previously announced, will be the expanded population here in Oregon, and that will begin on January 23rd. I'll note that these vaccines did not magically appear in Oregon today, nor the last time I checked were we actually able to order them. So the message is patience for folks, which I know everyone's really eager to see more vaccines getting here. But that announcement was made that vaccines that they had previously held at the federal level will be released, and more to come on that. And then the expanded population includes 65 and over in Oregon for sure. We know that educators and those folks that are working in childcare and early learning settings are also part of that next expanded population. And then more conversations to come from the governor's office. Leanne, what would you add?
I think you have covered it well, Rachel. I have nothing to add. Thank you.
So Kara, would you want to add anything, or I'm happy to take questions, or I know we have a lot to do, so happy to move on and forward the written information as well.
Maybe we can just see if there are a couple of questions from Vaccine Advisory Committee members before we get into our agenda, just knowing that we'll be flexible this week in terms of our charge and scope as more details unfold over the next couple days. So does anybody have questions for Rachel about the announcement that has just been made by the governor about vaccine availability for adults 65 and older?
This is Leslie Sutton with the Oregon Council on Developmental Disabilities. And I have a question regarding the phase 1A populations that were already announced. And as I mentioned at our last meeting, I do appreciate the focus on equity. And sometimes with equity, we need to have an understanding that we need to do business differently. And the people with developmental disabilities who live in their own homes, in foster homes and group homes, and also their family members and people who support them are all included in phase 1A. And yet many are still waiting to even hear how they can possibly get the vaccine. We're hearing that there's trouble between having the local public health authorities connect with the developmental disability case managers, which there are 2 types in each region. And we're also hearing that there are challenges around different public health authorities saying different interpretations of the Oregon Health Authority guidance. And we appreciate our partnership with OHA, and we understand that some of that hopefully will be changing in the very near future. But my question is, what about the people in phase 1A that are still waiting to get a vaccine? We're really concerned about that distribution, and what can we learn from that that can pave the way for future waves of vaccinations as well.
Yeah, great question, Leslie, and I'll maybe start and then ask my colleagues if they have anything to add. I just want to first start with really an appreciation for you continuing to raise issues of equity. And I think that when, where, as you said, that means sometimes we have to do our work differently. And we know that certainly there is pressure and that folks expect that we are getting vaccine out quickly and to large amounts of people, which we surely want to do. But in that, we definitely don't want to lose sight or, jump over or forget about communities that have been most impacted in communities in 1A. So in a general sense, we will continue to be working to get 1A populations vaccinated, and then also those expanded populations. We've been working with local public health authorities to better understand and to better communicate, I should say, for those in 1A populations, where do they go? And so we are working on getting a website open so that people can come to OHA, and depending on what county they're in, get some information there. We know that some local public health authorities are working on matching with their partners. I think another piece to this is that, one of the conversations that we really appreciate having with you all in the Vaccine Advisory Committee is about what about populations that, we need to be looking at differently, that we need to be having culturally specific strategies, and a variety of other things. So I'm really hopeful that we can continue to have those conversations to get to the how, where we're talking now about, some of the what and the who, that it's like, how do we get to those folks who we want to make sure that don't get left behind. And I think your question is great in terms of what is it that we can learn that can help us in the next phases.
Thanks, Rachel. And we'll be addressing some of the vaccine distribution pieces tonight as well. Maybe have time for one more regarding the governor's announcement. One more question before we get started?
I had a question, and I was wondering, so are the vaccines being released because that's the second dose that's being kind of front-loaded now? Or is that what's being released now and there's still a reserve for the second dose?
I can answer that. So yeah, they are releasing what they were previously reserving as the second dose because they're ramping up manufacturing for the second dose. So they've secured multiple booster doses from both Pfizer and Moderna.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sharif. I'm going to go ahead and ask us to move into our first information piece tonight. Specifically, I believe I'm turning that over to Shimi, is that correct? or is that Dr. Dean?
I don't remember which, maybe when you pull up the presentation, we'll recognize it.
Yeah, I think we were starting with you, Shimi.
Okay.
In one moment, that's coming right away.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. And also as a reminder, we'll take questions after the presentation and we'll open up the floor. Tonight's presentations are, again, that grounding piece that we are working on to get everybody at the same page with the information. Decision making is happening on Thursday. So this, because it's an optional meeting tonight, again, it's more of that grounding piece so that everybody has enough information to make some decisions on Thursday. So I just want to remind folks of that piece. So whenever we're ready to go ahead and pull up the slides, that'll be great.
My apologies, some technical difficulties coming right up.
No problem. And then if you haven't already, I would encourage you to go ahead and in the chat, please place your pronouns. And then for OHA staff, if you are presenting or speaking, I would encourage you to also let folks know who you are so that we're all more familiar with the staff that we're working with, if that's helpful. So as we're waiting, do folks have, oh, perfect. All right, thanks everybody.
So my name is Dr. Shimi Sharif. I'm just going to take us through some basic background information about the types of vaccines that we're talking about together currently that are authorized for emergency use, and also some safety and side effects that people had raised concerns about last week. Next slide. Sorry, my chat keeps interrupting my screen. So a little bit about mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. So this is a relatively new technology. It's been in development in clinical trials and animal trials for the last 10 years. But to date, this is actually the first commercial and clinical use of mRNA vaccines. So mRNA is a type of genetic material. Your body naturally uses mRNA to send instructions when building proteins. Usually they're translated, they're made when your body sees DNA in your body and then creates mRNA, which is also called messenger RNA, to then build a key protein that your body uses to build cells or create other building blocks of cells. mRNA technology is new, but it's already being used in cancer treatment. And actually one of the big players in cancer treatment is actually the company Moderna that actually pioneered a whole line of just mRNA-based drugs. Next slide. So the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines give instructions to our cells specifically for COVID-19, a harmless piece that actually looks like the spike protein. The spike protein are these little red particles coming out of like the sphere that you see as a classic depiction of a coronavirus virus. And then this spike protein then gets recognized by certain cells in the body, which then basically triggers our immune response to recognize the spike protein when it comes with an actual virus and then teaches our body how to respond to it without actually being infected first. Next slide. So our immune system sees these fake spike proteins and builds antibodies that recognizes them. In the future, our immune system is now what we call primed to then recognize the COVID-19 virus as it enters the body and it can fight it itself without having to be infected first. So what makes mRNA viruses and vaccines different? So it's new technology, like I said, it hasn't been in clinical use ever before for the purposes of vaccination. There's no infectious material, but it's very delicate. And the reason it's delicate, it's a very small piece of genetic material coated in cholesterol fat envelope. So it's like a little coating that envelops it so that the body can then take the mRNA up and then be still intact so that it doesn't get broken down by your cells before it actually gets recognized by one. It's hard to store. So the Pfizer vaccine specifically, which is the first vaccine to be authorized for use, actually has to sit in -70 Celsius temperature. This is what we call ultra cold chain storage. And it actually has to sit on dry ice, which is solid nitrogen, solid and gaseous nitrogen, before it actually can be delivered to the sites where it's used. Moderna actually has to sit at relatively cooler temperatures, but not as cold, at -20 Celsius, but then can actually sit in a regular fridge for a little bit longer than Pfizer can. So again, once transported to a facility, both vaccines can only sit in a fridge for about 24 hours, and once a vial containing 6 doses for Pfizer and 10 doses for Moderna is opened, it needs to be used within 6 to 12 hours. Next slide. Next slide. So the mRNA vaccines, a little bit more background, just for those of you who are interested. So the Pfizer is the first of the mRNA vaccines that was on the market. It's 2 doses spaced 21 days apart, so about 3 weeks. The vaccine efficacy was noted to be 95%, and the way they measured it is they vaccinated half of a randomized group, and half of them received a sugar pill. And they noticed that 95% of the time, those in the vaccine group they actually noticed that 5 extra people in the sugar pill group actually developed COVID-19 symptoms versus those in the vaccine group did not. There was 162 cases of symptomatic, meaning all kinds of symptoms. So runny nose, sore throat, fever, cough, shortness of breath in the sugar pill group, which is the placebo group, and only 9 in the vaccine group. There were 10 total cases of severe disease. With severity, we actually say anyone who has a fever, is short of breath, and has symptoms that need them to go to the hospital, actually considered severe, and 9 in the placebo group, which is the sugar pill group, and then 1 in the vaccine group. Additionally, they noticed that when they broke the population down into over 65, that this vaccine efficacy actually remained quite high. At 94% of the time, it was actually able to prevent disease. And this is actually significant because vaccines in general work a little bit less in those over 65 because our memory responses for our immune systems tend to be slower and actually lose some of their memory responses when we get older. Again, Pfizer actually requires ultra cold transport. Next slide. Moderna, on the other hand, is 2 doses spaced a little bit further apart, 28 days, so 4 weeks. It's 1 additional week apart. Vaccine efficacy was very close to Pfizer at 94.1%, and this is for all age groups. Again, there were 185 cases of symptomatic COVID-19 in the sugar pill group, the placebo group, and only 11 in the vaccine group. 30 cases of severe COVID-19 and 1 death were all noticed, but they were all in the placebo group, so not in those who were vaccinated. And there is no difference in efficacy by age or ethnicity, meaning that even in over age 65, this 94.1% efficacy was noticed unchanged, and it can actually sit in normal freezer temperatures. Who is included in the vaccine trials? So this is a question that's come up actually quite a lot as we do meetings with our healthcare staff. So the numbers of people enrolled compared to a typical vaccine trial, which actually happens over the course of up to 3 years, these vaccine trials, just because of the speed with which they were conducted, as well as the urgency with which they were conducted, they actually enrolled 10 times as many participants as in a usual vaccine trial. So for reference, when the flu vaccines were first being developed, some of those vaccine trials actually enrolled about 4,000 to 5,000 people each, and they followed them over about 1.5 to 3 years long. In this case, this vaccine was developed over a much shorter period of time, about 8 weeks minimum before application for EUA could be submitted, and therefore they enrolled 10 times as many participants, over 43,000 for Pfizer and over 30,000 for Moderna. The participation in the trials, this has historically been of great importance. Enrollment in our clinical trials has historically discriminated against people who are of non-white heritage. So it's actually significant that these trials were actually able to enroll 30% of non-white populations. Pfizer enrolled 10% Black and 13% Hispanic populations, and Moderna actually enrolled 10% Black and 20% Hispanic or Latino populations. Older adults were enrolled about 45% in the Pfizer trial, defined as ages 56 and over, and Moderna actually displayed their data as being 23% over the age of 65. We actually don't know exactly how many participants were between the ages of 56 and 65. Next slide. Again, to address a question that came up earlier from folks, what is the difference between an EUA, which is an emergency use authorization, and a full approval? So an emergency use authorization is a way to get a drug or a vaccine out to the general public, especially during times of emergencies and public health disasters such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And the way they do this is by setting certain criteria that have to be met to ensure that the vaccine is efficacious, as in it does what it's supposed to do, and also meets certain rigorous safety standards. And especially safety standards mean to prevent serious life-threatening diseases, which is in this case COVID-19, and also have an acceptable risk safety profile, meaning that it does not cause side effects that can itself cause severe illness or death. Next slide. So the restrictions on the COVID-19 vaccines are that they're not authorized for use in children under the age of 16, and that's specifically because children under the age of 16 were not enrolled in these trials. One other thing to note is that while Pfizer is actually authorized for use in people over 16, Moderna is actually only authorized for people over the age of 18. That's one major distinction. And further studies and approval are necessary before children can be vaccinated. Next slide. So are the COVID-19 vaccines rigorously tested? And the answer is yes. Over 70,000 people between the two trials participated in these trials. No skip steps. The main thing that's different between a full approval and an authorization for emergency use is that the FDA normally actually collects extended safety monitoring data over several months to look for several long-term side effects for a period of at least 6 to 8 months before they can actually issue the paperwork. In this case, because the actual efficacy and immediate term safety were actually met, an authorization was able to be issued with formal paperwork to look at long-term safety to be proceeded in the next 6 months. So this is while the vaccine itself won't change in the next 6 months, 6 or 8 months in which we might expect an approval, the numbers for the efficacy might change a little bit because they're 95 and 94%. And the longer you observe people, that those numbers might change a little bit. And also the safety, we'll see any kind of long-term safety considerations will be published as well. Both trials included both a minimum of 8 weeks of follow-up for at least half of their participants. And the reason it's half minimum is because most trials enroll participants in a rolling basis. They rarely ever get all 43,000 people enrolled at the same time. So they continuously enroll and just make sure that they all meet at least 8 weeks minimum from the time that they started to the time that the EUA is applied for. It does not imply that the authorization was done too quickly or the vaccine is not safe, because like I said, there are certain benchmarks set out. So until the federal government can actually observe that these benchmarks were met, the authorizations are not issued. Next slide. So in addition to the safety evaluations that the FDA conducts, there are actually 3 independent advisory committees that review the results from the FDA to ensure that there's a third party actually looking at the safety data and ensuring that this is safe for the American public. And specifically, that's the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. This is a national committee that advises the FDA. The ACIP, or the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, is a general body that advises on all vaccines for the United States, and they sit within the CDC. And finally, for the Western states, so Washington, California, and Oregon, there's a third independent advisory unit that actually advises on vaccines coming from the federal government, and that's specifically the Western States Vaccine Safety Committee. And this committee routinely still meet to actually recommend guidelines and safety recommendations on how the vaccine is even distributed and actually getting to people now that we're several weeks into vaccination. Next slide. So what are the side effects after vaccination? So these are the side effects that were noted in the trial. Again, in those 8 weeks of follow-up that we have from both of those trials, these are the main side effects that they were able to observe. We have ongoing data about safety and side effects coming just from our trial, from our vaccine experience here in Oregon, and that we can definitely share with you later today. So the most common side effects after vaccination are injection site reactions. So that's a rash, swelling, anything that you see immediately on the skin where the vaccine was given. Fatigue, headache, muscle pain, and chills are common, and this is usually common in the first 2 days after vaccination. Joint pain is a much more rare side effect, but again, same thing. It's actually because the immune system gets revved up to start doing its job, and joint pain is actually common because it's actually one of the areas in which the immune system can affect. And then finally, fever, also as a result of immune system activation and not a result of disease. This can also be common depending on the age of the person as well as the type of vaccine. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to take us into certain frameworks to consider when we sequence limited supply vaccines like the ones we're discussing today. Next slide. Oh, actually, before we go, any questions? I know I just threw a lot of information at you.
Thanks, Shimmy. Why don't we take a couple questions? Do folks want to unmute and ask a couple questions?
Yes, this is Nanette. I have a question. And I'm curious as to whether or not it's feasible to think that the companies would work together in creating the vaccine instead of separately. Moderna was early on with the type of vaccine.
Nanette, I don't think it's just me, but I can't hear after would the companies work together to produce a vaccine, all of that kind of got garbled by like this electronic sound. Can you check your mic?
Or
Nanette, yeah, maybe if you can put it in the chat too, we can address it that way.
Thank you.
While she is doing that, I just want to say thank you. That's incredibly complex information. You break it down really, really well. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Sandy.
So are the vaccines different? I don't know if ingredients is the right word, or are they the same? That part's a little confusing to me. I guess they can't be the same if they've got different effectiveness rates, but I'm just trying to understand that.
Yeah, they're not exactly the same. So each company has slightly proprietary information as to what kind of mRNA they're using, what piece of the spike protein they've actually used the mRNA to recognize or to translate into. So that's one difference. The other difference is that Moderna sits at a much higher temperature than Pfizer. So they actually have a specific type of cholesterol particle that is able to sustain not sitting at such a low temperature, and it continues to stay stable. So that's another major difference. The other differences are some of the inactive ingredients can be very different, but that doesn't really affect the efficacy as much. So the efficacy is really based on which piece of the spike protein is it really recognizing or training the cells to recognize, and also just the way its stability and storage as far as the other ingredients.
Do we have any other questions?
Sorry, no, I do have a question about the distribution that is happening right now. I'm just curious to ask if folks who are getting the vaccines are receiving this information, a flyer or something along the lines of, you know, this is actually what you're receiving. And also curious about if it's just in English.
So the way they're doing this, because this is still an authorization for emergency use, there's actually a fact sheet for patients that's actually published in both English and Spanish, and all patients are given that handout to read. I'm not sure how it works in large scale vaccination settings like at Salem Health, for example. I'm not sure if patients have the vaccine sheet ready to read beforehand, but they're definitely given a copy when they're there at the clinic. But for example, in our healthcare systems, when healthcare providers receive the vaccine, they get emailed the vaccine sheet, the fact sheet to read beforehand, so that they can actually schedule the appointment with full informed consent.
And Shimi, Nanette's question is, are the two companies planning to work together for mRNA vaccine? The thought is to expedite production for emergency use.
Yeah, as far as I know, they're not working together because the formulas and like the recipes that they use are totally proprietary to each company. What they are doing though is they've started up multiple manufacturing plants, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. So that's how they're ramping up production.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to continue with the next piece that you're going to discuss about sequencing.
Okay, perfect. So next slide. So this is a little bit of an overview as to what's happening now and what informs this process that we're doing right now. So the federal vaccine allocation process actually started in December 2020. The feds released the EUA for Pfizer on December 11th, I believe, and a framework for how to distribute the vaccine now that it's actually been authorized by the FDA was actually devised by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, which then advises the director of the CDC on how to do that. Next slide. So ACIP's goals are to, I'm not sure why this says health minimize. It's to minimize disruption to society and economy, including maintain healthcare capacity, and also to ensure equity in vaccine allocation and distribution. I think I outlined this very briefly at the last session. So the two principles that ACIP outlined for vaccine distribution is one, to balance death and harm from COVID-19 disease, especially in those who are most vulnerable. And the second, to preserve those parts of society and occupations that are important to societal functioning. So that was the rationale by which the two groups, at least for phase 1A at the level of the federal government, were outlined to be healthcare providers thought to service a very high need right now in the pandemic. Because if the healthcare system crumbles, then we lose our ability to take care of people affected by COVID-19. And then the alternate scenario of those who are most at risk is especially those who are elderly and living in congregate care settings, and specifically those in long-term care facilities. Next slide. So again, so the two groups being healthcare personnel on the one side and long-term care facility residents on the other. Next slide. Sorry, I gave you a lot of information prematurely. It looks like the slides break it down. Population profiles for the ACIP distribution system is over 100 million people in the United States actually have at least one high-risk medical condition. Advance. And approximately 87 million are essential workers. So this is an outline by which phases 1B and 1C were advised to proceed. Again, this is advisory. This is a recommendation on the part of the federal government. So the two arms that the government was evaluating is essential workers uphold certain societal functions that are essential for society to move along. And then on the flip side, people with high-risk medical conditions are the most at risk to get a severe complication from COVID-19. So those were the two priority groups. As you can see with the overlapping circles, these circles are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There are plenty of people within the essential worker realm that are actually over 65 or are under 65 and have a additional medical condition. Sorry, like my chat's coming in the way. And additionally, like approximately 53 million adults are 65 or older. So those with high risk medical conditions under age 65, those over the age of 65 who are automatically at risk just because of their age, and then finally essential workers. And there can be overlap between these three groups. Of the essential workers in the US government determined that nationwide there are about 21 million healthcare personnel involved in that group. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, I think we might have missed one, but hopefully it wasn't important. There's something right below. Oh, maybe, okay, this is the right slide. Again, so like this is like a time-based graph showing as vaccines go up, if you imagine number of vaccines maybe on the left axis and time on the bottom axis. So as we go forward into phases 1B and 1C, the original ACIP recommendation, independent of today's announcement, was actually to target essential workers along with those over age 75 initially to start, and then 1C to target additionally those people over age 65 and those under age 65 with high-risk medical conditions and any other essential workers that are left behind. Oregon, like I said, does not define an essential worker. We don't actually have an Oregon-wide classification for who constitutes this group, but the federal government does. And essential workers in the frontline category can actually include a lot of our folks who have been incorporated in 1A, specifically first responders, education professionals, so teachers and support staff, food and agriculture, manufacturing, people working in corrections, U.S. Postal Service workers, public transit workers, and grocery store workers. So it's important to note, and I have some slides that outline this as well as a crosswalk that we can present later of where Oregon's as well as the federal government's outlines are similar and where they differ. So for example, even though frontline essential workers were supposed to be part of the 1B group federally, Oregon has actually already started to vaccinate first responders, and those who work in corrections. The groups that do remain are those in education who has already been classified as one of the first groups in 1B. And I think that might be it, yeah. And then other essential workers, which can include those who work in transportation, logistics, food service, shelter and housing, finance, IT and communication, energy, media, legal, public safety, and water and wastewater. So as you can see, like an essential worker can be a very broad classification, even though some of the roles don't really seem that they would meet like the same definition. It really depends on the industry within which they work. Next slide. So in addition to the ACIP principles, a couple other considerations to guide sequencing and the decisions made by the VAC, decisions made and considered by the VAC are actually to consider that the governor's primary focus is to increase throughput, especially with the federal announcement that came today. So to increase the number of vaccinations up to 12,000 doses per day. With the mass vaccination clinics that are happening around the state, we're actually approaching these numbers. Some of these mass vaccination units can actually vaccinate up to 1,500 to 1,700 people in one day. And we actually reached vaccine doses of about 8,500, up to 8,500 doses last week in a single day. Throughput is actually how quickly we can get through things. An example, like in this slide, is the Salem Fairgrounds held by Salem Health, where they actually gave out several thousand vaccines. Next slide. Next slide.
As we're waiting for that, this is Leslie, I'll just quickly chip in. Well, we appreciate mass vaccination clinics in the developmental disability community. People with developmental disabilities who are in phase 1A were turned away at that mass vaccination event. It's my understanding that that's been corrected, but I do want to make sure that it's clear in these events that certain people are eligible and should be given access. And then I also just want to put in, from a disability standpoint, we appreciate community events and community access to vaccines. We also recognize that's not accessible for everyone. many people experiencing disability because of their extreme fragility to the coronavirus complications can't feel like they can go to an event like that safely. And also some people who have behavior support needs can't go and wait for the after effects and all of that. So I just want to make sure that it's clear that while we appreciate that and that can get a lot of people, there still needs to be conversation about how to actually bring the vaccine to people, given that there might be some situations when that's the safest way for someone to receive the vaccine. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I really appreciate you bringing up these equity considerations because, like I said, this is one of several principles that we need to be weighing, and that's why we rely on all of you to kind of guide us, sort of co-create this process with us because, like you said, high throughput doesn't necessarily guarantee equity. It's just a way to get vaccine into arms. And, you know, some of the equity considerations will definitely become more important as we get to high-risk groups, which are the focuses of 1B and 1C. Next slide. Kristen, are we having technical difficulties?
So I'm showing slide 15, other considerations for group sizes and pace. Is that what's projecting for you all?
Oh, it just advanced a couple of slides at once. So I was at 12 when I asked you to advance. Can we go back to 13? I'm on 14 now.
My apologies. It appears my connection's quite slow. It should
okay.
catch up in a minute.
I'm also showing 13 shimmy. So
Oh, maybe it's my connection. Well, there you go. Now I'm at 13. I was at 14 for a little bit there. So other considerations besides high throughput are disease-based principles as to who to vaccinate first. So there are two major considerations when you go through this decision making. One is those who are at highest risk for death and dying. So that's morbidity and mortality from coronavirus. And two are those who are at high risk for infecting others. That would be a consideration for increased transmission. The one thing that we should note, however, is that while this vaccine very likely reduces transmission to some degree, we don't actually have current data saying how much and to what extent. So this can be a secondary consideration because we do believe the vaccine will probably limit transmission to some degree, but this is not something that we can confidently say as much as preventing the person who's vaccinated from getting sick. And finally, the other consideration as we go through this process is shipping consideration. This is an operational consideration. I know not a lot of folks are thinking operational. Some of you already are, but it's important to note because Moderna actually has to ship in allotments of 100 doses each to each site that's receiving it. And Pfizer actually has to be shipped in allotments of 975 doses. And the reason the number is much higher for Pfizer is because it has to sit on a bed of dry ice. And so therefore it's much costlier to ship and therefore the requirement for a higher dose allocation before a facility can receive it. Additionally, Pfizer needs to sit in an ultra cold freezer until it's ready to use. It can only sit in a regular fridge for about 5 days. After a regular freezer, one vial can only be used in room temperature for no longer than 2 hours before it's diluted with salt water, and about 6 hours once it's already added to salt water. Vial needs to then be discarded in about 6 hours after it's opened. So Moderna, on the other hand, can sit in a regular freezer, but then does need to thaw for 2.5 hours in a fridge. It can only sit out for 15 minutes once it comes out of a regular fridge. There's no need to dilute it with salt water, but the vial, again, just like Pfizer, does need to be discarded in about 6 hours after it's opened. Next slide.
That is the end of the slides.
Oh, okay. Any additional questions?
So Shimi, I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple questions from the chat. Sandy would like to know, will you describe how the state is going to distribute the people 65 plus years old based on the governor's announcement, and or where are the mass vaccination clinics besides Salem?
Rachel or Dean or Kara, could you answer that question?
How will the state, how will the state distribute to people 65 and older based on the governor's announcement?
Yeah, so we heard the announcement today. We're going to be working with communities, local public health authorities, hospitals across Oregon, and determining how to get those over 65 vaccinated. I feel like there was another part of the question, mass vaccination sites?
Yes, besides Salem.
Yeah, so I know that there's a variety of different things happening in different communities. Sometimes the public health authorities are doing the vaccination. Sometimes people are partnering with hospitals. I think I mentioned that we're working on a website so folks across the state know where they can go relative to the county that they live in. We also know that, for example, in the Portland metro area, the local public health authorities, which are the county health departments, are working with the major hospital systems to match eligible people to vaccination sites, and that we anticipate seeing more of those sites as well.
Another question in the chat from Suring is, how many vaccines do we have? What percentage of our population does that cover?
Let me pull that up, unless Shimi, you have it off the top of your head.
I actually don't. I was going to look that up too, what our current allocation was.
And would you be looking up allocation prior to today's announcement or after today's announcement?
The allocations actually happen weekly, I believe. So there wasn't an allocation update today, just the announcement. So they were separate. So we'd be looking at the current allocation received prior to today.
Also, Dr. Sharif, would you kind of explain us what the process is like for Oregon to kind of get allocation? Is it based on population, or what kind of data do they use for us to kind of get the vaccines allotment?
So far, it has been population-based. There are some considerations with this announcement that the vaccine allocation method could change. We just don't, unfortunately, have any details as to specifically how that's going to change just yet, but we'll definitely keep you updated.
So as you're looking this up, according to today's Washington Post, Oregon has been allocated 290,225 first doses. Is that roughly accurate? 290,000?
That sounds about right. Rachel, would you happen to know if that included second doses or that part?
Yeah, I was going to say, oh, sorry, Shania, you were going to say something else?
I'm just looking at Washington Post state by state analysis, and they're stating it's the first dose allocation.
To this point, we've received first and second dose allocation. So all of our allocations are not purely in first dose. There are many more in first dose than there are in second dose, but they're not all just first dose. We have been allocated some second dose as well.
So does that mean that this is the combination of Pfizer and Moderna?
Yes.
So how does it lay out with the logistics that was just identified, with Pfizer having allotments of 935 to go out for distribution?
So
pertaining to Zinnia's question.
Sorry, you broke up a little bit. So is the question how many Moderna doses to Pfizer doses, because the storage and shipping considerations are different? Was that your question?
Yeah. Yes, so, correct.
I actually don't have the numbers on the Moderna versus the Pfizer, but we have received less Moderna vaccines overall than Pfizer, because Pfizer actually started their allocations about 2 weeks earlier than Moderna. And also Pfizer goes in allotments of much larger numbers, but that's not to say that Moderna won't catch up in numbers over the next few weeks.
I have a silly question. Is the first dose and second dose of vaccine the same thing?
It is the same thing, yeah. It's just that your body needs to see that protein once more before it's actually able to mount a full response. So the way immune responses work is initially your body will recognize the protein, produce some antibodies, but then the types of cells that can then recognize a future virus and then create what we call the memory response to create antibodies in the future doesn't really get sort of jump-started until that second dose is also in there.
Also, the second dose time, I think it's like 21 or 28 days. Is there a buffer time calculated, or how strict are those time if somebody were to kind of take the second dose and there was a day of miss?
So we don't have specific data as to say like how many days can we really, either be delayed by to then not reduce efficacy. That data will be coming the closer we get to approval. However, there are several things that could delay the second dose already, even without intentionally delaying the second dose. And that's if you get COVID-19 in between doses, you're advised to wait until the end of your isolation period. So if you get infected really close to the timing of your second dose, that could potentially delay your second dose by a week or two. And then the other thing is there are antibody treatments for COVID-19. So if you do receive an antibody treatment to treat COVID-19 because of COVID that you've been exposed to and been infected by between doses, then that could delay your second dose by up to 90 days. And these are actually acceptable considerations, and they've been actually endorsed by the CDC as being okay to do.
Shimi, we have a question from Daisy. Do we happen to know if the side effects from the second dose are as strong as the first, or is there a difference? Or is there no difference? Excuse me.
Yeah, I don't think we have this information, Dean, unless you know specifically, because there are actually recommendations for some people who actually have a severe allergic reaction to the first dose to not actually get the second dose and instead be referred to an allergist. But in terms of like if we have data from the trial participants as to if they had a more like a stronger second dose reaction as to a first dose reaction, I'm not aware. I'd have to look that up.
I have two questions.
Sorry,
as
I
well.
was trying to find mute. Yeah, I don't think we have a strong difference between first and second dose side effects.
Sorry.
Dr. Raphael says, yes, there are more side effects with the second dose.
Yeah, more intense, particularly the chills and things that people experience. That's been, I think, reported in the trials and also anecdotally from people that I've interacted with that's gotten the 2 doses. While I'm talking, I wonder if you showed population estimates for the US, the 87 million, the 100 million. I think it might be nice if you could maybe extrapolate to Oregon to see how many people fall within certain categories of being over 65 or being older than 16 with one medical condition, that sort of thing, just so we kind of know the numbers that we're dealing with in terms of how we are going to be sequencing and in line with the mandate to vaccinate 12,000 people a day.
That's a good question. We actually did have a dashboard up. I just tried to load it again. It looks like it might be undergoing maintenance, a population planning dashboard. But we can take that back, Dean and I, to see when we anticipate having that data up for public view.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a similar question, and I think it might be helpful just for the process to agree how to best submit questions. Do we do a raised hand symbol? Do we speak whenever we can? Do we send them as text? I think it just helped the dynamic.
Sure. Thank you for that, Zhenya. And I know it's hard because we're like 5 minutes before we want to wrap up too. I would encourage for folks, if you continue to have questions for tonight, specifically around what Dr. Sharif has presented, whether it be phasing, or excuse me, sequencing, or the vaccine science, I would encourage you to go ahead and either put that in the chat right now, and we can take those questions and get answers for you before the next meeting on Thursday. I do want to, and thank you for that. I will think about better process ways to ask questions. I know this group isn't shy to jump in there, and so that's part of it. But I do know that Kristen was about to ask a question before we got into more discussion. So I'm going to ask her to go ahead and ask her question.
Thank you, Natu. I have, I think, a two-pronged question. One, how long is this effective for, the vaccine? Is it going to be, or is it expected to be like a flu vaccine where you have to get it, once a year? And then I also have questions about family members that live in households together and its effectiveness. If I were to get a vaccine, but my husband didn't, how that works in relationship to its effectiveness.
Yeah, so to answer your second question first, the transmission between family members, we actually don't have data to say that this vaccine, what the efficacy of the vaccine is in preventing transmission. Our thought process is that it's likely to be somewhat effective. We just don't know how effective. So that's why, at least outside of family member exposures, we still recommend physical distancing and masking. To answer your first question as to how long the vaccine works, so for now, in terms of public health policy, we're actually still recommending that anyone outside of 90 days after their vaccination, if they're exposed to COVID-19, be considered a true contact in that case. But we actually don't know. We actually anticipate that the vaccine is actually much more effective than just 90 days, but we don't have specific data to say yet. We anticipate that it's likely to be at least as effective as natural immunity, which has been shown in certain studies to be about 6 to 8 months long, if not longer, but we just don't have the specific data yet.
Zhenya, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I know we still have a couple more minutes, so
yeah.
please.
Perhaps before Thursday, I think it would be really helpful to get a sense of the supply side and the demand side. So I know this 290,000 doses that are available, that allocated, is that for the foreseeable future? Is that growing like by a certain number each week? And then on the other side, the demand side, how many are considered healthcare workers? How many are 65 plus? How many are adults under 65 with chronic condition? I think without those two pieces, it will be kind of hard to make some of the decisions.
Okay, thank you for that. I would ask that in our last couple of minutes, do folks have additional things that they would like answered or prepared for Thursday's meeting that we can offer you as far as additional information from OHA staff?
So the population planning data, I do have to ask with the teams that deal with that data to see when we can actually produce it, because we did have like a preliminary dashboard. I just don't see it up anymore. So there might be some maintenance or considerations happening. In terms of how many healthcare workers, I think that might have been part of the population planning data as well. So I think that's a easier number to drill down as well. So we can try to get that for sure.
Yeah, we've been estimating with the healthcare workers between 350 and 400,000. And we were trying to be, if you will, liberal and include a variety of healthcare workers to fit our definition, including healthcare interpreters, including those folks who are caring for individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities, including traditional health workers and whatnot. But definitely we've been looking at numbers in terms of the population, age, comorbidities, and all of these things, with some caveats that there's some overlap that we would need to work through to come to a number that's more accurate.
This is Jamila, and I'd like to acknowledge that a member of the VAC requested that any flyer or information that's given to people when they get their vaccination is shared with the VAC. So we'll get that to you.
Thank you, Jamila. I also want to let folks know that there will be more information in and around specific data for our communities of color that will be presented on Thursday for the meeting for the VAC. So more information will be given to you on Thursday as we get closer to trying to formulate a recommendation. For tonight, right now it's 6:30. I want to honor your evening. If you have further questions that you would like to get a little more detailed information, please go ahead and either send myself an email or Jamila an email or Kara an email. I know lots of emails are happening right now, so I encourage you to go ahead and just shoot us that, and we will try to get either some type of fact sheet to all of you or have those things addressed in presentations that are coming up on Thursday. So with that, thank you everyone for all the questions, and thank you, Dr. Sharif, for the information. We'll resume on Thursday morning at 9 a.m. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to OHA staff. We know that things are moving very, very swiftly, and so we're moving and grooving. So thank you so much, everyone.